The last thing she saw was the vast, indifferent sweep of the desert sky, turning from copper to deep purple. The last thing she felt was the still warm embrace of the New Mexico soil. And as the darkness claimed her senses, a final lucid thought surfaced. She did not think of her father, nor of the pain. She thought of the feather bundle, a symbol of the untamed freedom she had so often craved. And with that she surrendered, her body finally giving out, her spirit drifting into a profound silence, suspended in the vast, waiting wilderness between one life and the next. Consciousness returned not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow, creeping dawn. The first sense to awaken was smell. The air was rich with the scent of sage smoke, dried roots, and a clean, earthy aroma she could not name. It was worlds away from the stale, sour odor of whiskey and unwashed wool that had defined her existence. Next came touch. She was lying on something soft, a bed of woven grass covered with the thick, warm hide of a deer. A gentle, consistent warmth radiated from a small, contained fire nearby, a stark contrast to the sporadic, angry heat of her father's hearth. Then sound. Not the violent howl of the desert wind across an open plain, but the gentle, rhythmic trickle of water over stone. A sound so peaceful it felt like a song. For a long moment she kept her eyes closed, convinced she was in a dream. Perhaps the waiting room of the eternal silence she had once desired. She was afraid that opening them would shatter the illusion and return her to the cold, hard reality of the homestead. When she finally found the courage to open her eyes, she saw him. He was sitting by the fire, his back to her, working on what looked like a piece of leather with careful, deliberate movements. He was an old man, his frame lean but strong, his long grey hair tied back with a strip of leather. When he eventually turned, she saw a face that seemed carved from the very mesas around them, a landscape of deep lines and weathered patience. His eyes were dark and penetrating, but they held no anger. They held a profound and ancient stillness, the look of a man who had witnessed the turning of 1,000 seasons and was surprised by very little. Her body reacted before her mind could process, a jolt of pure, conditioned terror seizing her. She tried to scramble backwards, to flee, but a cry of pain escaped her as her battered muscles protested. The movement was a pathetic shuffle, and the man simply watched her, his expression unchanging. He made no move to stop her, no move to approach her. This simple inaction was more disarming than any word he could have spoken. He allowed her the dignity of her fear, and in doing so, began the slow process of dismantling it. The days that followed unfolded in this same quiet rhythm. Her rescuer, whose name she did not know, tended to her with a silent, methodical care. He would leave a bowl of warm, nourishing broth and a cup of cool water near her sleeping place, then retreat to his own tasks, never watching to see if she ate. He cleaned her wounds and applied poultices of crushed herbs and pungent pastes that cooled the fire in her skin and eased the deep ache in her bones. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, impersonal. Like a craftsman tending to a delicate tool, Clara, who had only ever known care as a prelude to obligation or touch as a warning of pain, was utterly bewildered. This man asked for nothing. He demanded no gratitude, no explanation, no conversation. He simply provided what was necessary for life to continue. This profound and unconditional quiet was the most powerful medicine he could have offered. It gave the wounds inside her, the ones no pace could reach, the space they needed to begin to heal. She started to watch him, her fear slowly giving way to a deep, weary curiosity. She watched him track the sun's progress across the canyon wall, watched the effortless way he moved through the wilderness. A man entirely at home in a world that had always terrified her. As her strength returned and the fog of pain began to recede, her eyes started to take in the details of her sanctuary. It was a small, hidden camp tucked into a protected alcove in a secret canyon, almost invisible from above. Everything had its place, a life distilled to its essentials. tools carved from bone and stone, baskets woven from desert grass, a small clay pot for cooking. And then she saw it. Folded neatly on a flat stone was a piece of cloth. Its colors faded by time and sun, but the pattern was unmistakable. A series of interlocking shapes woven in a deep blue and warm brown. The sight was like a key turning in a long-locked room in her memory. A fragment of an image surfaced, hazy and dreamlike. Her mother, her face young and unlined by sorrow, wrapping that very same pattern around Clara's small shoulders, humming a melody without words. The memory was so vivid, so painful, it stole her breath. This place, this man, was somehow connected not just to her survival, but to the only source of pure love she had ever known. The threads of fate felt suddenly visible, and she understood that her desperate flight into the wilderness had not been a random act of survival, but the first step on a path that had been waiting for her all along. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the canyon walls in strokes of orange and crimson, the old man approached her. It was the first time he had come to her with a purpose other than delivering food or medicine. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see not just the girl huddled in the hides, but the flickering spirit within. He knelt and placed 2 items on the flat stone before her. The first was a familiar wooden bowl, steaming with a fragrant, strengthening stew, the aroma a promise of continued life. The second was a small doeskin pouch tied with a leather cord. He opened it slightly, revealing a collection of dried, pale roots and small seeds. He did not need to explain their purpose. Clara, who had seen the plants of the high desert her whole life, knew that in that pouch lay a sleep from which there was no waking. The old man said nothing, but his silence was a language all its own. He had mended her body, but the choice to live, to truly inhabit it once more, was a choice only she could make. He would not force her to stay. He would not chain a spirit that wished to be free. The choice was now hers. The bowl or the pouch, life or the oblivion she had once so desperately craved. Her gaze lingered on the small doeskin pouch. It represented an end to memory, an end to the scars that lined her back and the fear that had been carved into her soul. It was the easy peace, the silent forgetting she had prayed for in the dark of her father's homestead. But when she looked at the steaming bowl, she did not just see broth. She saw the patient hands that had gathered the ingredients, the quiet fire that had warmed it, the profound unspoken belief that her life was a thing worth saving. She saw the flash of her mother's cloth, a single vibrant thread of love stretching across a wasteland of years. To choose the pouch would be to sever that thread forever. To choose the pouch would be to let Marcus Hewitt have the final victory. A slow, determined fire ignited in her chest, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it as her own will. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she reached past the pouch of final sleep and took the bowl. Lifting it to her lips, she drank. It was more than sustenance. It was an oath. Each sip was a declaration that she would not be erased. She was choosing to live. From that day forward, everything changed. Her healing was no longer a passive state of receiving care, but an active process of learning to inhabit the world. The old man, sensing the shift in her, became her silent teacher. The wilderness, once a terrifying void, was transformed into a living classroom. He never lectured. He simply did, and expected her to watch, to learn, and to follow. He showed her how to find water by watching the flight paths of doves at dawn. He taught her to distinguish the silvery leaves of the healing plant from the nearly identical leaves of a plant that brought only sickness. She learned to move not like a frightened girl crashing through the brush, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of a hunter, placing her feet so as not to disturb a single stone. Her hands, once raw from lye soap and scrubbing, now grew calloused from different work. Grinding seeds into flour, weaving grass to make rope, and learning the patient, rhythmic art of creating fire with a bow and stick. Hello, my dear friend. This is Arthur Blackwood, your narrator of historical tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. In the harsh and unforgiving territory that stretched beyond the small settlement of Silver Ridge, New Mexico in the year 1878, the life of 17-year-old Clara Hewitt was measured not in days, but in the moments between her father's explosions of rage. She was struck for burned cornbread, for water carried too slowly from the well, for the simple crime of existing in his sight. Her father, Marcus Hewitt, was a man consumed by bitterness, a failed rancher whose dreams had withered like the grass in the drought that plagued their land. Each evening he returned from surveying his dying cattle, his heart empty of hope, but filled with a seething anger that demanded a target. And it always found the fragile form of his only daughter, their homestead. A weathered structure of adobe and splintered wood was not a sanctuary. It was a prison, a place where the howl of the desert wind was almost a mercy, for it often masked the sound of her sobbing. Clara had mastered the art of silence, of moving through the cramped space like a shadow. Her spirit was a flickering candle flame, struggling to survive against a relentless wind of cruelty. She did not dream of rescue or romance. In the darkest hours before dawn, curled beneath a thin wool blanket, she dreamed only of the deep and eternal peace of nothingness. She moved through her existence with a careful, learned grace, born of pure survival. She knew which boards creaked beneath her step, the exact moment to remove her father's plate before his frustration could turn to violence. Her world was a careful map of dangers and safe corners, a constant arithmetic of staying alive. She found her only comfort in the land itself. She learned to read the gathering storms in the distant mesas, their power a reflection of the tempest that lived within her own walls. She watched the ravens soar on the updrafts, their freedom a painful ache in her chest. They were everything she was not. Unbound, powerful, masters of the endless sky. Her hands, though rough from hauling wood and scrubbing floors, held a secret gentleness. She would find tiny, stubborn desert flowers pushing through the hard-pan soil and wonder at their determination, seeing in them a mirror of the part of herself she fought desperately to preserve. This was her hidden world, a place of quiet watching and fierce, silent yearning. A refuge no man's hand could ever violate, buried beneath a loose stone in the floor. Wrapped in a scrap of faded calico was her only true treasure. A small silver locket, tarnished with age, containing a lock of honey-colored hair. It was the last trace of her mother, a woman whose face had become a hazy, dreamlike memory, but whose gentle voice she could still hear in the whisper of the wind. It was a charm against the gathering darkness, a silent testament that another world, a softer world, had once been real. But even the most careful survival has its breaking point. The end of her world arrived on an afternoon when the sky burned copper and gold, as if the heavens themselves were aflame. Marcus returned not with his usual simmering rage, but with a terrifying emptiness in his eyes. The last of their cattle had died, the drought had won, and his final hope of salvaging anything from this cursed land had turned to dust. The cheap whiskey on his breath was stronger, the despair hanging on him like a burial shroud. He said nothing as he entered, his silence more frightening than any shout. Clara felt the air in the homestead grow thick and suffocating, charged with an unspoken finality. He did not yell. He did not curse. He simply turned, his face a mask of absolute ruin. And in that moment, Clara saw that the man was gone, replaced by something utterly shattered and intent on shattering the last thing within his reach. This time, as his hand rose, she knew it was different. It was not discipline. It was erasure. A primal, long-sleeping instinct exploded within her, a force that screamed not for submission, but for life. As his shadow fell across her, she understood with bone-deep certainty that to remain in that homestead for one more heartbeat was to accept her own grave. The world shattered into a single explosive instant. The animal need to survive. Clara launched herself from her chair, a strangled cry tearing from her throat as she bolted for the door. The wood splintered against her shoulder as she threw herself against it, bursting out into the scorching desert air. The shock of the heat was a slap to her senses, a violent awakening that momentarily cleared the terror from her mind. She did not look back. To look back was to risk seeing the monster in the doorway, the shadow of the man who had been her father. And she knew with a certainty that shook her very foundation that if she saw him, her legs would give out. So she ran. She ran from the flickering, angry yellow light of the homestead, spilling out into the gathering dusk, a stain on the clean purity of the desert evening. She ran from the sound of her own name being bellowed into the wind, a sound that had once meant command, but now was nothing more than the desperate howl of a tyrant losing his only subject. The ground was a treacherous landscape of sharp stones and hidden cactus, but she felt none of it. Her feet, hardened by a life of deprivation, barely registered the cuts and stabs of the unforgiving earth. Her world had narrowed to the burning in her lungs, the frantic, panicked hammering of her own heart against her ribs, and the singular, desperate need to put as much distance as she could between her past and whatever future awaited her. The landscape of Silver Ridge, which had always seemed a monotonous prison of brown and grey, transformed under the fading light into a place of profound and terrifying beauty. Towering rock formations became silent, watching sentinels. The twisted juniper trees whispered ancient secrets on the wind, their scent sharp and clean in her gasping lungs. For the first time, she was truly alone in this wilderness, not just observing it from the confines of the homestead, but part of it as wild and untamed as any creature that called these desert mountains home. A strange clarity began to pierce through her fear. Every ragged breath she drew was her own. Every aching muscle was a testament to her own will to survive. The pain was different now. It was not the passive, humiliating pain of a beating, but the active, searing pain of exertion, of flight, of life itself refusing to be snuffed out. Blood from a cut on her cheek, where a thrown tin cup had struck her earlier, trickled down her jaw. But it felt less like a wound and more like war paint. She was no longer a ghost in a dusty homestead. She was a living, breathing creature fleeing for her life. And in that desperate flight, she felt a spark of a power she never knew she possessed. A part of her mind, the part that had learned to endure, screamed at her to stop, to return, to accept her fate. But a newer, stronger voice, born in that final moment of defiance, urged her on, promising nothing but the unknown. A promise that was suddenly more compelling than the certainty of death, deeper into the rocky hills where the familiar landmarks of her oppressive world had vanished. She finally allowed herself to stumble to a halt. Hidden behind a cluster of ancient boulders, she leaned against the cold stone, her body trembling uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged. Painful gasps, it was in that moment of stillness, as her fingers searched for purchase on the rock face, that she felt it. It was not the rough, natural texture of the stone. It was a series of smooth, deliberate grooves, carved into the rock and weathered by countless seasons. Her fingers traced them in the fading light, feeling the unmistakable rhythm of a human hand. Below the grooves, wedged into a crack in the stone, was a small bundle of feathers tied with what looked like dried plant fiber. It was a marker, a sign. It was evidence of a world that existed entirely outside of Marcus Hewitt, outside of the failed ranch and the whiskey-soaked despair. This land was not empty. It had a secret language, a history written in stone and feather that she had been completely blind to. The discovery did not frighten her. Instead, it sent a strange wave of calm through her shaking body. It was a profound and humbling realization that her suffering, which had felt as vast as the desert itself, was but a tiny, insignificant story in a land that held countless others. She was not the first person to seek refuge in these hills. She was not the first soul to flee in the gathering darkness. This small, silent discovery was the final thread that connected her to her old life. The exhaustion held at bay by terror and adrenaline now descended upon her like a physical weight, a crushing blanket of heat, exhaustion, and fatigue. The strength that had propelled her out of the homestead and up into the hills simply vanished, leaving her limbs feeling like lead. Her vision began to blur, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, swimming and swirling into hazy ribbons of light. The world tilted on its axis, the ground seeming to rush up to meet her. Her legs, which had carried her so far, finally buckled. She crumpled to the earth, the impact barely registering through the fog of her collapsing consciousness. There were no words of praise, no encouraging smiles. His approval was a far subtler thing, a quiet nod when she identified the right plant, or the simple act of leaving a more complex task for her to complete in his absence. These small, unspoken gestures of trust were more valuable to Clara than any applause. They were the building blocks of a new self, a person defined not by her suffering, but by her growing skill. Weeks turned into months. The scorching heat of summer gave way to the cool, clear nights of autumn. Clara's laughter, once a sound she had thought lost to her forever, began to return. At first, a quiet, rusty thing, but soon a genuine expression of a spirit slowly remembering how to be light. The old man, for his part, found in her a comfort for the long years of his solitude. She was the daughter he never had, a living echo of the kindness his wife had once found in a friend from another world. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he finally spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, but his words were clear. He told her his name was Neshoba, which meant wolf in his language. He told her of his wife, Morning Light, and of a young white woman who would sometimes visit their camp many seasons ago. A woman with hair the color of desert sand and eyes that held the gentleness of the evening sky. He said this woman was different from the others. She did not look at his people with fear or hatred, but with respect and curiosity. She and his wife would trade things of value. Morning Light would give her desert medicines, and the woman would bring them needles and cloth. He said the woman had a gentle spirit, but a deep, quiet strength. And one day she had come to them with her newborn daughter. He had woven a small bracelet of blue beads as a gift for the child. As he spoke, Clara's world began to reform around a new and astonishing center. He was talking about her mother, the gentle hands, the forgotten songs, the cloth. It was all real. He had known her. His wife had been her mother's friend. This revelation was a seismic shift in the landscape of her soul. Her rescue had not been an act of random kindness from a stranger. It was the closing of a sacred circle, a debt of friendship being repaid across a generation. She was not an outsider who had stumbled into this sanctuary. She was, in a way she could never have imagined, coming home. The bond between them, already forged in crisis and quiet understanding, was now sealed by the grace of their shared history. Years passed. Clara never returned to Silver Ridge. The world she had fled from became a distant memory, a shadow that grew fainter with each passing season. She lived with Neshoba in the hidden canyon, learning the old ways, becoming a keeper of ancient knowledge. When Neshoba finally passed, crossing into the spirit world with a peaceful smile on his weathered face, Clara did not leave. She stayed in the canyon, continuing his work. She became a healer for the scattered Apache families who still moved through the hidden places of the desert, and occasionally for settlers who heard whispers of a white woman who knew the medicine of the earth. She never married, finding her great love not in a single person, but in the family she built from the broken souls who found their way to her door. Her redemption was not a gift she was given, but a treasure she forged from the ashes of her own suffering. Her destiny, set in motion by the compassion of a widowed Apache, was not to be tied to a new life, but to be fundamentally and purposefully free. For true freedom, she had learned, is not the absence of pain, but the strength to transform that pain into purpose. The narrator would say that Clara Hewitt's name was never carved onto a monument, but her legacy was written in the quiet survival of those she helped. She was the answer to a prayer whispered across generations, a bridge between two worlds, a living testament that even the deepest wounds can become the source of the greatest healing. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us what part of the world you're watching this story from. Leave a comment, And to not miss the next adventures, subscribe to the channel. Until next time, this is Arthur Blackwood, wishing you peace and strength on your own journey.